Welcome. I'm Adam Gravois. I'm a member of the Ethical Society of Austin. And I want to thank you for being part of this, for helping us to start a conversation about what kind of world do we want to live in. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our speaker, James Croft. And after that, we'll open it up, after he's had a chance to speak to you, we'll open it up to the floor for your ideas and thoughts. And then we'll have some snacks. But first, I'd like to, where's your clicker? Oh, you got it. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Houston Tillotson. Can we give them a hand? Say thank you. Very awesome. I'd also like to thank our event co-sponsors, IACT, Interfaith Action of Central Texas. And Center for Inquiry and Oasis Austin. Thanks, guys. I'd also like to take just a quick moment to talk about the Ethical Society of Austin. Don't worry, I won't be long. We've been here in Austin since the mid-90s, and we're part of a longer tradition of ethical culture that dates back to 1876, about the same time that this university was founded. The core idea of ethical culture is really, really simple. We don't ask our members to be believers or non-believers. You can be religious, atheist, spiritual, whatever. We come together for community, for fellowship, and to work together where we agree. That's really the core idea, to work together where we agree. Because there's so much that we agree on. So this event is a little bit of that, writ large. So I thank you for being willing to be part of that. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, James Croft. He is a leader at the Ethical Society of St. Louis, the largest humanist congregation in the world. He is originally from London. He was raised, as he likes to say, on Shakespeare, Sagan, and Star Trek. And if you look him up on Facebook, you can see he walks the walk. He studied at the University of Cambridge, graduated from Cambridge, and has a doctorate in education from a little place called Harvard University. James is a proud gay humanist, an activist for justice who walks the walk in Ferguson, St. Louis, and pretty much everywhere he goes. And I really liked the definition of humanism that he put on his Facebook page. One life, one world, one hope, each other. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming James Croft.
Thank you so much for being here. It's a great turnout, and this is my very first visit to Austin, Texas. So yes, you can cheer for your own cool city. I have already seen more hipsters than I've ever seen in my life. So it may be a function of where I'm staying, which is just a couple of blocks away, but I feel right at home. It feels great for me. I am a leader at the Ethical Society of St. Louis. And you've just heard a little bit about what an ethical society is. But to be clear, our society is a congregation for anybody, regardless of their religious beliefs or lack of religious beliefs. A place where people come together around shared values, not shared beliefs. And I'm going to be talking a little bit today, this evening, about those shared values and what we can do to bring them alive in the world. On May the 13th, 1939, a German transatlantic liner set out from Hamburg, Germany, seeking to dock in Havana, Cuba. The liner carried Jews fleeing from Germany, hoping to escape the Nazis, seeking refuge in America, a country, at least according to its self-image, dedicated to welcoming the immigrant and the refugee. Their plan was to stay in Cuba until gaining visas to enter the USA, and on a plaque inside the Statue of Liberty, these words from Emma Lazarus's poem, The New Colossus, are engraved. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Huddled on that liner were 937 wretched souls, homeless, tempest-tossed, yearning to breathe free. The liner's name was St. Louis. When the ship reached Cuba, however, most of the passengers were refused the right to disembark. 908 people were forced to remain on board. Cuba decided it had taken enough refugees, and xenophobia and anti-Semitism was rife there as it was in much of the world. They didn't want these Jews, so they didn't let them off the boat. Popular opinion in the USA was not favorable to the voyagers either. The Great Depression had devastated the economy, and people feared competition for US jobs. Nervous about their own economic condition and consumed by xenophobia, most Americans didn't feel it was the time to extend a hand to others. The golden door was closed, the lamp of liberty extinguished by a cold splash of fear. The St. Louis was turned away, and while hundreds found safety elsewhere, 532 were trapped in Germany during the Holocaust. 254 were killed. History repeats itself. This past January, my heart broke as by executive order, the President of the United States repeated the mistake of Franklin Roosevelt and slammed that golden door. With a stroke of the presidential pen, the entire refugee program was halted for 120 days. Refugees from Syria were banned from entering the USA indefinitely. A 90-day visa suspension was placed on 7 Muslim-majority countries, and a cap of refugees of 50,000 was instigated, less than half the cap placed by the previous president. In effect, that means that this order could have prevented at least 60,000 refugees from ever entering this country. 60 St. Louises. Imagine them. 60 ocean liners filled with refugees, families leaning on the railings, lined up end to end, children held up so they could see. And there in the distance, the Statue of Liberty, its torch painted black, the words on that plaque defaced by spray paint, "Refugees keep out." The New Yorker expresses our predicament powerfully, I think, with their February cover. The president's executive order on immigration and refugees was an ethical outrage, a moral disgrace, a betrayal of the highest values of this nation and of humanity itself. That the wealthiest nation in the world should turn its back on some of the most vulnerable people on earth was unconscionable. Unconscionable, but not, I am sorry to say, that surprising, because we are living at a time of civic and political crisis, both in the United States and across the wealthy West. And Trump's closing of Americans' doors to refugees is symptomatic of a worldwide trend toward a narrow, closed, petty vision of what it means to be human. As we know, Donald Trump, undeniably the least qualified and most dangerous politician of recent times, managed to win the US presidency, and already he is dismantling American freedoms, gagging government departments, denying visas to refugees, ordering the building of a border wall, denigrating the press while brazenly lying to them and calling for a return of torture. His appointees to major cabinet posts are a parade of cartoon villains, and each day reveals anew their incompetence and corruption. He makes major policy announcements by Twitter, in between feuds with film stars and reporters. He casually reveals state secrets, enraging our allies and delighting our enemies, and he practically dares anyone to do anything about it. The scandals of Trump's still young presidency are so numerous that they are scarcely countable. A recent example which particularly annoyed me being his crass politicization of the Boy Scouts Jamboree, where he encouraged children to boo his political opponents while impressing upon them the importance of loyalty. Loyalty to him, of course. The ascendancy of Donald Trump is a sign that something is deeply wrong in America. Commentators across the political spectrum, including prominent Republicans and conservatives, have decried him as a peculiar moral hazard and a unique threat to the American way of life. His willingness to incite violence against protesters, to bar press outlets he deems to be too critical of his politics and his person from events, to make explicitly racist pronouncements, to flirt with white supremacists, to brazenly insult the parents of dead veterans and veterans themselves and people with disabilities and anyone really. All this is far beyond the limits of normal political discourse in America and a symptom of a deep social dis-ease. Yet Trump, despite, perhaps because of his basic outrageousness, won the support of a large swathe of the American population. And we need to listen to what that support is telling us. Huge numbers of people feel left out, abandoned by the political process as practiced by career politicians, and left behind by an economy which isn't benefiting them, and a culture which is moving too fast from what they consider to be good and true. We don't have to sympathize with those feelings, or with Trump, their chosen champion, to recognize that for a demagogue like Trump to be elected as President of the United States, and he's undeniably a demagogue, there must be something broken with American politics. Trump is symptomatic of a broken system, and on both the left and the right of American politics, prominent figures are decrying exactly that, a broken system. Both Trump and Bernie Sanders, in his bid for the presidency, in different ways argue that the economic and political system is rigged against the poor and the powerless, and both argue for a sharp break from the status quo. Trump's violent, authoritarian nationalism is certainly different from Sanders' benign economic populism, but they share the belief that something is fundamentally wrong with America, and that a radical rupture with the past is required. Overseas, the picture is likewise grim. I was shocked to my core when my British compatriots voted to leave the European Union and embrace Brexit, which is definitely my least favorite word of the last few years, a disastrous and backward-looking decision born of a mixture of economic and cultural dispossession, racism, and misplaced patriotic fervor. You can see, in fact, that those who supported Brexit look very, very similar to Trump supporters in America. Yet perhaps we should not have been so surprised to get this outcome, for the very same conditions which led to President Trump are at work in the United Kingdom too. Back in my homeland, just as here in the United States, many people feel left out of the political process, forgotten by elites who scorn and deride them while doing well of their misfortune. That's how they see it, at least. Many of the talking points which made Trump so popular could be heard on the lips of Nigel Farage. I don't know what it is about right-wing demagogues that they are all orange, but it seems to be a universal law that is true. He is the former leader of the UK Independence Party, and he campaigned for Brexit with these slogans: down with political correctness, international cooperation and Muslims, up with me first patriotism, and much stricter immigration controls. No surprise that Farage endorsed Trump for president, and now they are best friends, Farage meeting with Trump multiple times. And nor are Trump and Farage isolated phenomena themselves. They represent a far-right resurgent across much of Europe, As London's Daily Telegraph recently reported, the toxic combination of the most prolonged period of economic stagnation and the worst refugee crisis since the end of the Second World War has seen the far right surging across the continent from Athens to Amsterdam and many points in between. It's hard, at least for me, to look squarely at these disturbing trends and not conclude that our politics is indeed somehow broken, and that our culture is experiencing a tectonic shift in which many of our political and cultural norms are being ruptured. If we step back yet again and take a broader view, the view from our globe and a planetary perspective, the news is no better. Every day brings yet more confirmation that we are destroying spaceship Earth. The climate of what humanist Carl Sagan called the pale blue dot and the only home we have ever known is rapidly changing. And as ice caps shrink, sea levels rise, and weather patterns shift perhaps forever, we can no longer ignore the enormous damage we are doing to our habitat. We float in space on an infinitesimal fragment of the cosmos, a minute fraction of the universe which just so happens to provide us with everything we need to live. The only space rock we know which can support us, and we are killing it. As the seas rise and the storms rage, our elected representatives deny the reality of what we can see with our own eyes and plan to suck even more oil from the veins of the earth, hack even more coal from its bones. Even our planet is broken. This political dysfunction is taking its toll on the citizenry. Reports of hate crimes are on the rise, as are reports of bullying in schools. Confidence in institutions is at a historic low. Gallup reports that a majority of Americans distrust the medical system, the banks, organized labor, big business, every branch of government, the criminal justice system, I ran out of fingers, public schools, and organized religion. Indeed, the only major institutions a majority of Americans now trust a great deal or quite a lot are small businesses, the police, and the military. A president with authoritarian tendencies, plus a public which trusts only in the police and the military, is a terrifying prospect. And similar trends are in evidence, as the Daily Telegraph suggested, from Athens to Amsterdam. This is not alarmism, though I am alarmed. I think alarm is an appropriate response to danger, and I believe the shared project of civilization is in danger right now. We can already see here in America a xenophobic, nationalistic populism has been festering, has already gained a truly terrifying influence over the highest offices of government. We are right now witnessing a frightening and lightning-fast assault on American freedoms and civic institutions. And while white supremacists stalk the corridors of the White House, neo-Nazis openly walk the streets of American cities, giving interviews to major media outlets who fawn over their fashion choices and describe them as dapper. This is where we are right now. The world darkens. Carl Sagan, scientist, educator, humanist hero, wearer of the perfect turtleneck, seems prophetic now when he wrote the following in 1996. I have a foreboding of an America in my children's or grandchildren's time, when the United States is a service and information economy, when nearly all the key manufacturers have slipped away to other countries, when awesome technological powers are in the hands of very few and no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues. When the people have lost the ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in authority, when clutching our crystals and nervously consulting our horoscopes, our critical faculties in decline, unable to distinguish between what feels good and what is true, we slide almost without noticing back into superstition and darkness. Whenever our ethnic or national prejudices are aroused, in times of scarcity, during challenges to national self-esteem or nerve, when we agonize about our diminished cosmic place and purpose, or when fanaticism is bubbling around us, then habits of thought familiar from ages past reach for the controls. The candle flame gutters. Its little pool of light trembles. Darkness gathers. Demons begin to stir. It is chilling reading that now, 20 years later. I believe the candle flame is guttering, that darkness has gathered, that the demons are stirring, and that it is our duty to fight them. As I look at what is happening here in the USA and across the world, I see two potential futures for the human species. Two different stories fighting for supremacy. In one, we succumb to nationalism and xenophobia, closing our borders and our hearts, turning inward, afraid of the world. We look with increasing wariness on and hatred on minorities within our own nations and ramp up tensions between our country and others. We elevate greed and tell a story of scarcity and competition, every person, every nation for itself. Our world community fractures into enemy nations, our nations into tribes vying for dominance, our communities into splintered and suspicious fractions. The ever-dwindling resources on our ravaged planet force us to compete with our neighbors, stretching those tensions even further until inevitably they snap. War, but this time with nuclear arsenals on every side. That is the dark future. That is the Sith Lord future. The other future, thankfully, is more hopeful. It is the Jedi Knight future. In this second future, people of goodwill, people of all religions and none, all races, all backgrounds, all sexualities and genders, people with disabilities, poor people, rich people, young and old, human and alien, recognize the danger we are in and decide to fight. To fight not against other people, but against hatred and small-mindedness and fear. Fight for decency and openness and hope. So to the question of this evening, which truly is the question of our time, what sort of world do we want to live in? Do we want a world of increasing factionalism, self-interest, greed, and violence? Or do we want a world of cooperation, compassion, and freedom for all people? The choice is ours, but we have to make that choice right now and start working for the sort of world we want together. I think we can do it, although I'm a little nervous about our prospects with every passing day. I want to get a little personal for a moment and tell a story about my time in St. Louis, Missouri. I moved to St. Louis to serve the Ethical Society as a sort of apprentice clergy person, finishing up my training in June of 2014. And in August of 2014, Mike Brown was murdered. He was a black man shot by white police officer Darren Wilson. And the city exploded with activism. And I felt a calling to get involved in that movement, which was building to fight for racial justice in my new home city. And shortly after the shooting, I attended a bunch of planning meetings with local clergy. And we planned all sorts of protests together. We spoke, we marched, we shut down streets together, representatives of all religious traditions and none. We faced down tear gas and pepper spray and rubber bullets arm in arm. And a couple of months into the campaign, I was asked to represent the Ethical Society of St. Louis at this mass meeting on Ferguson. It was a major interfaith gathering featuring Cornel West. And you can probably imagine that I was kind of proud and excited to receive an invitation, the opportunity to speak out for racial justice and against structural racism on a platform featuring Dr. Cornel West. Oh, sure, I was totally going to do that. So I prepared carefully and thought deeply about what I wanted to say. The event was held in Chaifetz Arena, which is a huge sports complex on the campus of St. Louis University. And the program began with a prelude of drumming, and drum beats echoed round the cavernous arena as the clergy and I walked from the green room to the stage. I looked out across the more than 2,000 people gathered there, and I felt a sense of excitement and moment rising in me, mixed with a reasonable amount of nervousness. I took my seat and scanned the crowd and noticed a large number of young people, many wearing hands up, don't shoot t-shirts. That had become the unofficial slogan of the protests at that time. And it was clear that many protesters from the front lines had turned out for the event. Then the musicians had us on our feet singing, "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." Do you know that one? This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. I think the clergy around me were a little surprised by my knowledge of the freedom songs, but I have been a choir boy all my life, and humanist or not, you cannot take the chorus out of a choir boy. So I was singing along. Then the first few speakers made their remarks without incident. Many seemed to connect well with the crowd, which applauded and cheered and stood, fists raised to the air. The tradition of the black church was on full display, with preachers pounding the podium, setting the audience on fire. And my chance came to speak after a piece of Christian scripture. I had chosen a humanist poem by Algernon Black, who was once a leader at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. It's called A Call to the Living. It's a super great poem, and I thought it was moving and rousing and thoughtful and appropriate to the occasion. And as the Christian pastor before me offered her reading, I went over the text I had selected, scrolling up and down on my iPad and preparing myself to speak. When my time came, I crossed the stage and I stepped up to the lectern. Now, I have spoken in many places before many different crowds, but this felt a little different. I felt a weight of responsibility because I was representing my community and my worldview at a time when human dignity was at stake. And I felt that in the midst of all these potent religious messages from different religious traditions, I should speak for our common humanity and remind everybody that the work of securing justice is our work and it cannot be left to God. That's my belief, at least, from my ethical culture tradition. So I said, if there is to be salvation for humankind, it will be because we save ourselves. And then I read my poem, and it was fine. It was not as fiery a declaration as some of the other speakers. As you can probably tell, I was not raised in the tradition of the black church. But shortly after I sat down, after another speaker had finished, the tone in the audience shifted. The young activists who had packed the arena were restless. They felt they weren't being heard, that they were being talked at, not given a chance to speak. And soon chanting began in the arena, "Let us speak, let us speak." And before long, a host of young people was coming down the aisles and up onto the stage, insisting on their right to be heard. And luckily, the MC for the event understood what was happening, understood the depth of the young activists' anger and passion, and offered them the microphone. And one by one, their friends gathered at their side. The youth of Ferguson began to tell their own story. Stories of police brutality, of racial profiling, of frustration with an unjust system, but also stories of resistance and shared struggle and hope. I will never forget, never. There was one girl, 11 years old, baby-faced and hardly tall enough to see over the podium. And as she spoke of what she had seen on the streets of her city, her eyes shone with intensity, her face radiant with conviction. And with quiet authority born of personal experience, she named the injustice of racism in the world and affirmed her dignity in its face. She said to the crowd, "I want you to tell me how you really feel. Mike Brown didn't get the chance to say how he felt before he died. It's almost inhuman. What makes humans human is because we have feelings. But what most of these people do," and at that point she pointed to all the clergy and me among them, "what most these people do is that they say how they feel and how motivated they are and what we should be doing, but they don't do it." And the audience roared. I learned two important things from that young girl, at least two things, which we will all have to learn if we want to secure the sort of world we all desire and deserve. The first is that whatever your religion, or if you are non-religious, there is a tradition of justice seeking you can draw on to motivate you to fight. As I've worked alongside clergy in the streets of St. Louis and in the hall of that auditorium, I have learned about the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world, the Muslim call that all believers should be standard bearers for justice. I've marched with liberation theologians in the Catholic tradition and felt the Christian vision of the beloved community come to life. And of course, I've seen my own members at the Ethical Society of St. Louis put their humanist views into action, their commitment to the dignity of all people, driving them to fight for the sort of world we want to build. Regardless of our religious beliefs, we can all work together to create that world. I learned that in the streets of Ferguson. The second thing I learned is that if we are to build the world we want to live in, it's going to be very difficult. That 11-year-old girl was calling us to take real action, to risk something in the name of justice. We don't want to be those people who say how we feel and how motivated we are and what we should be doing, but don't do it, do we? We don't. Well, over the past 3 years, I have developed a much clearer idea of what it will take to change this world for the better. I have seen people tear-gassed and pepper-sprayed and kicked and choked and dragged and beaten and arrested without cause. I have been arrested without cause and spent 15 hours in a jail cell. It was fine. I sang freedom songs. And Disney. Disney songs sound great in a jail cell, I found. I have stood countless times outside the St. Louis City Justice Center, now known by all our local activists as the Injustice Center, waiting as activists are released from our latest protest. And to build the sort of world we want is going to take real risk. And we are going to have to ask ourselves whether we are prepared for it. What are we willing to risk for justice? The truth is, we all need to take on a lot of risk if we are going to build the sort of world we deserve. Now, as a humanist, I have a vision of the sort of world that I want. It is a vision where together we take to the streets, rebuild civic institutions, and mobilize all our collective power to tell a different story to the story of competition and exclusion which has gripped American culture. A story that says we're all in this together, that life is not a competition between people, a zero-sum game with winners and losers. I believe we can work with one another, each of us bringing out the best in other people rather than the worst. I believe we can provide healthcare for all our citizens, open our borders to those who want to come here, invest in science and education rather than prisons and weapons, face our history of racial injustice and white supremacy, and make America a beacon of hope for the world. And I believe that despite the many challenges we face, and they are legion, I've outlined some of them today, it is possible to create that vision. And in the past year, in fact, we have seen an extraordinary coalition of people from all over the world taking to the streets to help create the sort of world that we deserve. We've seen, just to give a few examples, the Women's March, the March for Science, the Equality March in DC, the spontaneous mobilization against the travel ban, which as an immigrant I was particularly inspired by. And there is no indication that any of this is going to stop or slow down. We're just getting started. And if one good thing has come out of the past year, it has been the reminder that huge numbers of people all across the globe share an ethical vision of a humane and welcoming future for all people. People everywhere are telling the hopeful story of the kind of world they want to live in. And you can do the same. I'm calling you now, right here in this auditorium in Austin, Texas. I'm calling you to start building a better world together. The world we seem to be heading toward, the Sith Lord world, is not the world I want to live in. It is not the world I want my imaginary children to grow up in. It is not the world we dream of as people committed to human dignity and to reason and to justice. So we need to decide what sort of world we do want to live in and go out and tell that story. The more passionately and vividly we tell our story of a just world, the more people will join us. And the more who join us, the more we'll be out there telling that story of hope for the future. And we need them, and we need you to help us reach them. If we do this, if we start now and work together despite our differences, then we have a chance to save the world from demons. I'd like to end with a poem by actor and writer Danny Brick, which was shared with me by another humanist leader earlier this year. And it's called If You Could. I know, if you could go back, you would walk with Jesus. You would march with King, maybe assassinate Hitler, at least hide Jews in your basement. It would all be clear to you. But people then, just like you, were baffled, had bills to pay and children they didn't understand, and they too were so desperate for normalcy, they made anything normal, even turning everything inside out, even killing. And it's easy for turning the other cheek to be looking the other way, for walking to be talking. And they hid in their houses and watched it on television when they had television, and wrung their hands or didn't. And your hands are just like theirs. Lined, permeable, small, and you would follow Caesar and quote McCarthy and Hoover, and you would want to make Germany great again because you are afraid, and your parents are sick, and your job pays dust, and where's your dignity? Just a little dignity, and those kids sitting down in the highway and chaining themselves to buildings, what's their problem? And that kid, that's King. And this is Selma, and Berlin, and Jerusalem. And now is when they need you to be brave. Now is when we need you to go back and forget everything you know and give up the things you're chained to and make it look so easy in your grandkids' history books. Now is when it will all be clear to them. We need you now. I'm calling on you now. Whatever your religious tradition and whatever the issue you care about most, go out and tell that story of the world you want to build. Go to rallies and marches and protests, sign petitions and vote in elections, build coalitions and run for office. Go change the world. Because if you don't, who will? Thank you. I'm done. I'm not saying anything else though.
So at this point, we'd like to get a conversation going, and we'd like your input about what kind of world you want to live in and where you would, what is that story that needs to be told? So basically, if you want to raise your hand, I'll bring the mic over to you, and we can kind of, I'll sort of traffic manage, but definitely want to, like I said, hear from you. Who would like to kind of start that conversation going?
Something that came up that I think a common issue between, let's say, our side and the other side might be the idea of justice. From maybe, I'm just going to say the other side just to create a different group, but I think from the other side's point of view, they feel like the world had not treated them justly. From our point of view, we don't feel like the world is treating us justly. I think maybe the issue that might join us, which I think you talked about, common issues, might be the idea of what is justice and what does that look like. But I guess the question I have for you and the audience, what sort of venue would be the place to do that, as opposed to showing up in Charlottesville and fighting on the street, some sort of a neutral setting in which both parties, let's say the two different sides or four different sides, or whatever it is, might get together and have a calm discussion about what the world should look like for both people, and maybe find some common ground that way around the idea that we both sides want a just world. What would that look like from their perspective? What would it look like from our perspective, maybe? But I'm just wondering what sort of a venue you might see for that sort of thing, and how do we make it happen? How do we extend an invitation to the other side and even have them take us up on it? I don't know if you have any ideas on that.
Honestly, I think right now we're about 40 years too late for that. We don't have time. This culture is under direct threat by elements which want to dismantle your basic freedoms and are already doing it. I think that there is a core of people who are not interested in honest debate and discourse, who have demonstrated that again and again and again, and we just have to accept that that's the case and win this immediate round. We have to be very clear on who our political opponents are and defeat them, and then we can start building civil society back up. But it's too broken right now, I think, to engage in good faith dialogue with some of the elements in American politics. I think it's very clear that they have demonstrated again and again that they are not interested in good faith dialogue. And the ethical thing to do is to accept that message, is to say, you've told us what your values are and what you care about in the political arena, and it is not sitting down with your political opponents and trying to build common ground. So we have to adjust to the reality of that, and I think we're many decades too late to accept that's the case.
So I graduated high school 5 years ago, 2012, so I'm able to speak, at least to some extent, to what public education is like, at least from where I'm from. Is from a deep red part of West Texas, and I have several friends who are, were my friends growing up, who are now, one is in the Ku Klux Klan, and a bunch of them are really sympathetic to Trump's really terrifying predilections. And a concept that was introduced to me early on in college that I think would be really beneficial to maybe, it may not address what's going on now, but it could certainly maybe stemmy some of this vitriol that goes on as people are like young and moving out into the world and trying to find a place. I think it's really disconcerting for people to feel like everything is sacrificed on the altar of our God, the economy, and you feel super inadequate if you can only ever find justification through economic well-being. A concept that was really important to me was a concept of something that's good in itself. Justice, for instance, being good in itself, or art, being good in itself. It doesn't have to be for some other reason, it doesn't have to be for some other end. So a lot of people pursue, well, any number of different things, maybe it's, you know, an ethnically pure state or something like that, in order to try and find something because they don't understand that there are things that are good in themselves.
I graduated from high school just 54 years ago. And from the South, from Houston, and in my high school there were 0 black students. I came to the university and there was a group of black students that were kept in one end of one wing of one of the dormitories. There were no African American students in any of the athletic programs. Over time, we've seen that change. Right now, I'm reading a book by Van Jones called Beyond the Messy Truth. And he points out that the liberals and the conservatives have not conspired together, but have, through their own means, have created this divisiveness. The liberals have been dismissive of the concerns of the African American community by taking them for granted, since when somebody like Trump runs for office, 90+% vote for the Democrats, and so they can just take them for granted and not address any of their needs. Conversely, the working class white people that are on the conservative side feel like they've been neglected and dismissed. We have this divisiveness that both sides are responsible for. I'm only partway through the book, so I don't know if he has a solution to this, but and I'd be surprised if there is a solution, frankly. But the notion of working together sounds good, but when, well, look at here we are in East Austin, one of the few secular groupings that I've seen take place in this part of the city. When you go to any secular event, the number of white folks is close to 90 to 100% of the participants. How do we come into East Austin to make them part of our vision of a unified or nice society? I don't know.
I have a unique experience of having, well, maybe not unique, but I have a very far liberal side of my circle of trust, and I have a very deep red circle of trust. And over the election, doing all this study and stuff like that, I found a huge divide in language. And one of my favorite people on the planet, Tim Minchin, recently described this as it was like two different. They were playing tennis in two different courts. And we don't often, I mean, you think you're discussing the same thing and have very different perspectives, very different definitions of words. I mean, the Democratic side fought with words like bigotry and xenophobic and everything, and those were supposed to be pejorative, and they weren't. They were like, yeah, so, and, you know. So I was wondering, my question is how do we, I mean, even the language up here today sounded to me very liberal. How do we help cross that divide when, you know, I know that a certain sect of my family would sit here and walk out because it sounds to them not their language?
I think that's a really interesting question. So I love language, right? I'm really interested in the study of political language. And if I was giving this talk to a totally different sort of audience, I would not use the language I would use today. And I think you're absolutely right. And the construction of a language to talk about areas of our common concern that are broadly political, which does not divide down kind of obvious conservative and liberal tracks, is a really important thing to do. So I recognize the challenge that you note. I think it's true to say I did not use the words conservative and liberal in my talk, and in my mind, I'm talking about something much deeper. The problem with the current administration is not primarily that it is conservative. It is completely untethered from reality, totally corrupt, enormously incompetent, and evil. And all those things should be people who are conservative should be able to agree on that too. And I noted in my talk that people who are conservative are agreeing with that and are increasingly speaking out about that. So finding a way to articulate that there are fundamental breaches in civil society going on right now. And it's not just about politics, it's also about what's going on in the streets of American cities and in our police departments and in our justice system and things like that. It's not just elected politics. Finding a language that is a moral language that draws people in, I think is a really interesting one. And I've got a ton of theories, if you want to talk afterwards, about particular constructions of words that will help to engage that dialogue. I think the primary challenge, there are two different things that I think make it really difficult right now. The first being that there is a increasingly large segment of the population has basically opted out of the idea of dialogue. They're actually actively disinterested in it and seek to undermine it as part of their political program, and they're very open about this. You know, if you read extreme right-wing news organizations, they are very clear that they are propagandists. They know that they are not telling people the truth, and they are perfectly happy with that. So that is a big problem. We can't really dialogue with that. And then there's the other part, which is that so many people feel, and I think this is not a conservative liberal thing, I think this is across the spectrum, that traditional trusted authorities are no longer to be trusted, like the media, like schools, like universities, for whatever reasons, like doctors. And that makes it very difficult to actually communicate. And I think the only thing we can do about that is people like you have to join established institutions and change them so that they are more responsive to the concerns of people who no longer trust them. We can't abandon institutions. And one of my big questions in my mind, I'm just about a millennial, I'm 34 years old, so I'm just about a millennial, is whether the millennial generation will engage in civic society by joining existing institutions or kind of opt out like the previous generation has seemed to do. I think we're going to be joiners, but I don't know, because I hope we are, because we desperately need to, because we have to rebuild trust in those civic institutions. I don't think we can do without them.
I'm Jewish, and I grew up in a town and went to an elementary school where there were 3 other Jewish kids, my brother and Lori Reese and David Reese. And I experienced constant, subtle anti-Semitism throughout my childhood and into adulthood, including my professional life. And my dad converted to Judaism, and my grandmother was anti-Semitic. But she was a constant part of my life. She came to my bat mitzvah. She gave me a culturally appropriate gift at my bat mitzvah. I didn't even know how anti-Semitic she was until she was close to death. And because of this experience, I had to learn how to cope with difference and how to engage with difference in a committed, and I don't want to use the word civil because that has really bad connotations these days. I like to think of it as centered insistence. And the world I want to live in is a world in which centered insistence is a regular practice, where we can stay in relationship with people who have views we find troubling, and we can speak to them about these views and have a conversation in which we stay in our position and we challenge them, but stay in relationship at the same time. That's the world I want to live in.
I live in a subsidized housing project located in the Mueller development, which is a liberal bastion in the east side. And because we get subsidized federally, we have a mix of incomes, a mix of races. And I have discovered that in our building, despite the fact that we have lots of each other, we don't mix with each other, especially in small, more intimate groups. We can go to a meeting together, but we never go back to each other's apartments to have a bull session or something of that sort. And in order to try to make a little bit of a difference, I have proposed that we have small groups of people get organized to eat together. Most of the women there say they're tired of cooking, and tired of eating alone. And so we've been forming a group. And then it occurred to me that in order for us to have a good group, we should mix racially as well. And so I've got agreement, and for the 4 of us will include a really nice black woman. And I'm anxious to get that going and see how it works, and see if we can be a bit of a stimulus to other people to take moves. Because what it all comes down to is what are each of us as individuals willing to do that's a change in our life.
So it feels to me as though we have been playing this right-wrong game for so long that now everybody's taken a side and pointed the finger the other way. And, personally, all these years we've been thinking everything was getting better. We hang out with people who think the way we do, feel the way we do, we socialize with people that agree with us. And so there's been this feeling of things are getting better. Less racism, less misogyny, more equality, everything's doing great. But there's always been this subtle undercurrent. And you could feel it, and we could all feel it. And I think, forever the optimist, I'm sure, but I think that this eruption, that this, whether you call it a backlash, whether you call it, is encouraging. Because whereas you couldn't see or feel where this was before, it's obvious where it is now. And I think that we have come to a point where we have to decide, not just the liberals or the conservatives or the ones that want cooperation and equality versus the ones who want power and control, but we, all of us. As a humanist, we're all of those things. And so we have to decide individually where we're going and what we want to create from this point forward. And we have to focus on creating that. Because if all of our attention goes to what we don't want, what we have to fight against, what's wrong with the world, then that's just going to get all the attention. Our attention needs to go to where we want to go, the world we want to build, and we've got to quit excluding anybody. I don't care if it is a Ku Klux Klan member, or whether it's a black activist, or whether it's a refugee, or whether it's a white male. It doesn't matter. We've got to quit labeling people and excluding them from the discussion. That's what got us here. And so I just think that we all have our own work to do in our own consciousness about labeling others, judging others, criticizing others, and excluding other viewpoints. Because until we all come together, we're all going to be separate.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Simone Talma Flowers, and I'm with Interfaith Action of Central Texas. And thank you so much for tonight. I'm holding this device in my hand, and I, not that I'm addicted to it or anything like that, but I must say this device has brought a lot of attention to the realities that a lot of people of color have faced for a long, long time. And it has allowed some of the pains, some of the experiences to be viewed live. So you get to see some of the injustices that have been happening. And even though they've been happening for a long, long time, it's nothing new. But you finally got to see it firsthand and believe it, that it was happening. And so as much as it's great that it's now being believed, it also has that sense that wasn't people not telling the truth before? So back to listening and back to believing people and trusting people. I believe we have to spend more time with each other, see the humanity in each other, look each other in the eye when we talk to them, and understand that, you know, we do have some goodness in us. And if we can focus on that. Yes, there's lots of bad in the world. And I'm not saying to be blind about it. But how can we see each other? How can we're going to be uncomfortable, and just being comfortable, being uncomfortable. And I like to call that space a sacred space. And if we can agree to just, in that space, to know that it's going to be a transformation, but commit to it. So that's how I see some of the ways that we can make this world better. And it comes back down to us as individuals and us being in the institutions and helping change systems. But it takes the individual within the system to speak up, speak out, and act.
I was hesitant to speak until I would get a clue. And when this lady spoke, I got a clue. Because she reminded me, and I'm not establishing authority here, but I am. I've taught government, politics, and democracy for 34 years now. So I've taught an entire millennial generation. And there's so much to be said and so much being said, but I'll tell you what I'd throw out in the classroom. First of all, suppose the world was exactly the way it's supposed to be. We put all our priority into this limited temporary lifetime. What if Donald Trump is a reflection of all of us, and he's what we needed? What if there is an absolutely strong and significant response to what Trump is doing, which you so well laid out, and we're blinded, we don't see what's going on? Do you see the reaction? Maybe this is what we needed. Conversations on race. I find many barriers over the years for various reasons. I appreciate the gentleman over there who took the initiative to say, well, we've got to bring in people who are different and just socialize together to begin with. On this Black Lives Matter thing, it's about cops and black men, right? So I grew up in Houston, Cashmere High School. Bel Air. And I know Bel Air because I wasn't allowed to go near Bel Air.
Right.
We weren't. But I grew up in Fifth Ward. I grew up in poverty. So I talk to my kids about, says, you hear a lot about the ghetto. Do you also understand the barrio? Do you also understand the trailer park? There are no exceptions. Do you know black people can be sexist and homophobic? Do you know homosexual people are often racist and even sexist? So we can't make, we're all human, we're in the same bag, we're doing the same thing. and Donald Trump or the tyrants come along, and they're teaching us a lesson if we'll listen and learn, and then do what we need to do to counter that. And you see it all over the place. Look what's going on with sexual harassment. Look at the response. And we talk about it, so we got the negatives of Facebook, but then we got the positives of Facebook or social media. So my biggest concern, and which I try to address in the classroom, and as a student pointed out today, she was trying to state it. I said, "Oh, you're saying I have a captive audience." Exactly, because she's talking about her red leaning, red state, blue state, red leaning. She put it that way, parents, and many of my students talk in that sense. And say, so how do I talk to them? I said, well, like I talk in the classroom. You see, my most conservative students in here eventually let down their guards, but you've got to be here long enough. And I've got to say, and one of the things that captures their attention is when I point out that I grew up in poverty, so I know what it means to be driving while black or just being black. I'm also a former Austin police officer. And I can tell stories of some of the most god-awful police officers and some of the absolute best. But you know what? We're not talking about that on either side. I've recognized the police are not telling the truth, and black youth talking about this matter are not telling the truth. Because nobody wants to admit the dark side that we all possess. And you've got to do that first. But you have to realize we all have a dark side. First of all, and you got to level first. Then you can begin talking.
I'm a bachelor's in social work at UT with a minor in government, so I don't know what you teach, but I'd love to take your class. And maybe the degree gives you an idea, but hopefully this also gives you hope in the sense that millennials want to be into politics. But certainly that is my ambition. A couple of different things on that note. To go back to our first question, so supposing good faith dialogue is something that's attainable and not 40 years too late, hopefully. I don't know, I guess I'm probably hopelessly optimistic in that. But I still think that it needs to be take place in addition to going to protests and trying to, fight for justice. One of the clearest representations, I think, of injustice is sitting in a historically black university and looking at the conditions of this university as compared to the university I go to, a couple miles away, that gets just buttloads of cash. So it's in a really different condition and historically very white. Anyway, so if there was a venue in which we could have good faith dialogue, I think that it also ties very well with the fact that this earth needs a lot of justice. I've been very fortunate to be part of an organization called American Leadership Forum, which takes prominent, by the way, also from H-Town, hold it down. Grew up in Houston, in a predominantly, my entire neighborhood was white. I grew up in Timber Grove near the Heights, but went to Westside High School, which was a branch, is a newer high school, but very, very diverse. Very fortunate to have all races represented in my, particularly in my U.S. history class, in an AP class, where we had really different conversations about history, which I feel very fortunate about. But regardless, going back, sorry, I know I talk in circles, but if there was a venue, I think that it is this earth, and I think that it is removed from a classroom and it's out in the field. It's, somewhere where we actually connect with where we're from and what we are, in whatever sense that is. But, I think nature is a really equalizing platform in which we can, we don't have things around us except for each other and really animals, things like that, what we are in a really raw, stripped down way. I think that's an important venue to have an equal or an equitable conversation in. Too, I would say, there's a lot of really interesting things going on. One of my best friends in my classes is black, and she's great, and we have really good conversations. They've started really diving into the inequity, even in the School of Social Work, where you would think there would be more minority representation, but yet most of my professors are white. Most are women, which is, I guess, more of a representation, although we don't have hardly any men in the School of Social Work. And anyway, there's a big movement to have a conversation and a dialogue on how we can be allies, but I think we don't spend time actually interacting with one another like everyone's touched on here tonight. You know, it's like I feel very fortunate to have grown up in an environment where my mom was an inner city high school teacher, ball trip, you know, she taught at Kashmir, things like that, where it was, you know, rough. It was in impoverished neighborhoods and stuff like that. So we had students that came and lived with us who did not reflect my white identity at all, but they were my brothers. They were the ones who wanted to be home at night and time to read me stories, and so those were the people that I grew up with and that I hold really dear. But anyway, but yeah, so regardless, it's just really important that we continue to have these conversations, but that we're inclusionary in them, and that we, like you said, like, you know, dialogue, it doesn't exclude anyone, it doesn't tell you that you're wrong, but also, you know, we have to be truthful and authentic, and I'm a huge proponent, I agree, right? We have to recognize that we all hold prejudice. What that prejudice is may vary from racism to sexism to homophobia to whatever, but it can be, you know, simple. It can be, I don't like this color, like, you know, flower, whatever. So, you know, we'll have to dive into that, and I'm a proponent of everyone going to therapy, which probably is like a social work thing, but really, yeah, hopefully. You know, until we start to have those kinds of conversations, understand where we're coming from and where someone else is coming from, I just don't know, yeah, where we can go. Sorry, I trailed off and lost my train of thought, but yeah, I do see millennials engaged too, so hopefully you hope for that. We're out there. I'm 23, so I'm definitely in that category.
Hi everyone, my name is Amanda, and I work for the school district. You know, years ago I taught high school science, so I have this perspective of like a pendulum swinging, right? Our conversations in society kind of move the way a pendulum does. And the only way we can get it to move is by having individual experiences and having those conversations. So while that sense of urgency is definitely here, we do need to engage in those conversations coupled with action. Where the venue is, we're already doing it. It is social media, it is having podcasts, it is, the only thing that's missing is that extra sense of action that each individual person has to also do something about it. So there is a culture, the Maasai, who greet each other by asking, "And how are the children?" And the response is, "All the children are well." Why? Because they have a value placed on, if the children are well, then everything is going well in society. And I think that for us, we really have to engage in what our values are on a systemic level. What is our experience of life? It's separate from asking whether you're a liberal or a conservative. You're asking, what have you experienced in life? And what has worked? What has been really painful? And what can we do to address it in a way that makes it more workable? One of the things that I'm really dealing with now, going back to the conversation of the kids, right now there's an issue of mental health issues being having increased by 35% in the school district. And this is it's alarming, because we're not just dealing with, you know, the kind of disciplinary issues that we normally have, which is, you know, the children will talk back to the teacher, or, you know, maybe have, you know, flip out every now and then. What we're dealing with is students choking each other or stabbing each other, and I'm talking 5, 6, 7 little tiny little babies. A lot of suicidal outcries. There's a lot of things going on. So if we know that the children are not well, there is something going on. I think we can all pretty much place our value in the fact that we care about our children. And so we want to make the world for them, it sounds rote to say a better place, but we really have to prioritize that value and the value that we have for our children. Because right now they're really not doing well. And there are so many different reasons that we can hypothesize as to why. And by the way, this isn't just one section of Austin that's dealing with this. This is all over the place. So if you think that it's just localized in some segments that are low income, you're wrong. If you think that it's just the helicopter parents that place too much pressure on the kids, you're wrong. It's everybody. Everybody's having a hard time right now. And high needs children, high needs kids create high needs teachers, which creates high needs administration, which creates a high need. We are all public education. And so if there's something going on in public education, it's because it's reflected in our society.
Thank you. I will be very short and very succinct. I appreciate what you've all talked about with inclusion and what you've talked about with conversation, and I think all those things are very important. Short of revolution, which I almost think what you're talking about, is what concerns me is the corporate takeover of America. It's the money that is influencing all of us so greatly, so badly. And when we can take back our politics from corporate America, when we can elect officials that represent truly what we feel and what we believe, all of this conversation, all of this inclusion will mean nothing, because corporate America is very strong, very powerful, and wields a very heavy hand.
Draw out a couple of threads that I'd like to dive into a little bit more. Firstly, I gave the talk that I gave to provoke you into thinking about this. Not because I necessarily think you'll agree, or even that I necessarily agree with everything I actually said. So it is meant as a provocation to consideration of our position. But I did want to dive into a couple of things a little bit along the theme of what I've just said. The first is that I know that a lot of people of goodwill get uncomfortable making strong ethical judgments because they feel like they are being judgmental about people. And I want you to take very seriously the difference between making a judgment about right and wrong and being judgmental about people, because those are different. The heart of ethics is judgment, not judgmentalism, but judgment, making distinctions between right and wrong, good and bad. And for the ethical culture people in this room, that is what ethical societies exist to do. There is a slogan on the banner outside, which is the place where people meet to seek the highest is holy ground. And highest implies a judgment as to what is good and what is bad. And we will never get anywhere refusing to make judgments about right and wrong. In fact, one of the things that has been worst for American society, I think, is that more liberal-minded people have been convinced that to talk about right and wrong is to be judgmental about people. And so we have vacated the language of values and given it entirely to only one side of the discussion. And we never talk about right and wrong because we feel uncomfortable about it. I think that's a big mistake. The second issue, and I think this is something for people to really grapple with, is the distinction between our personal lives and our personal relationships and what is required for systemic political change. The grave issues that we are facing with right now in this country are not, I think, about our personal relationships with our neighbors and in our communities. I honestly think we could change our personal relationships very profoundly and still not make major systemic and political change to this country. There is a quote from Frederick Douglass, which I love, which is, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will." And as you were just saying, there are many very powerful interests who do not wish this country to become the sort of country we want it to. It is in their direct personal, political, and economic interest to keep things going on the current trajectory. Nice chats, civil discussion that we all feel good about afterwards is not going to change that. It's not going to change that. And we have to be honest. Having more civil discourse is not going to change the political structures we need to change. Mass civil disobedience and disruption is the only thing that has ever been able to do that historically. And so I really want to impress upon people that we need to make demands of power now. We can't ask it nicely. We need to shut shit down until it cannot function without them changing what they're doing to us.
Thanks, my name's Mike, and I was going to talk about having civil conversations on a personal level, but then I'll go into another solution that I want to propose on a bigger level. I love the comment about asking, how are the children doing? That's a great way to open up a conversation with someone you politically disagree with. and get the discussion going. Yes, I acknowledge there's a lot of people who have decided to opt out of civil discussions, but I want to tell a different story too that kind of gives a different viewpoint. There is an African American gentleman going around telling stories about how he goes and makes friends with public Ku Klux Klan members, including leaders, goes to their house, goes out to dinner with them, meets them in a park, takes on a lot of risk. And he says he has converted over 200 people now and convinced them to quit the KKK. It's a wonderful success story. And he does that not by saying what you're doing is unforgivable, but by giving them a friendly, welcoming off-ramp. Now, I can't do that personally, but I can deal with my friends and family who are Trump supporters. And when they start changing their mind, sometimes I want to say, I don't care, what you did was unforgivable. And that may feel good, but that's not going to get us to the world we want to get to. You need to offer them a friendly, welcoming off-ramp. And one final comment solution that's a little bit bigger than personal issues. You mentioned that the system is broken. There's a lot of cultural issues that are broken, but we also want to admit our election process, the machinery is broken. In particular, gerrymandering issues. There's a lot of people trying to fix that through legislative means. There's a way we can all try and fix that through our own personal actions. If you live in a district where it's set up so one party's going to win no matter what, make it known that you're going to go vote in the primary for that party. No matter what your political views are, you're going to vote for what you think is the most reasonable person there. Basically, if someone gets too far right-wing, tell them you're going to be primaried by moderates and progressive people in your district. That will potentially change things. If you're really brave, actually go to the Republican Party meetings, and if you're really, really brave, actually go there and ask questions and speak up.
I'm Hans, I'm a member of Ethical Society, and I appreciate the talk. I've been trying to take notes. If you see anything that I've missed or misquoted you, please let me know, because we're going to capture this. We're really trying to the social media thing and really make this an event, not just for the promotion of Ethical Society, and all the other groups that are involved, like Austin Oasis and the Center for Inquiry, and Houston Tillotson, which I'm grateful for their commitment. But I want to say something personally. I've been very open about the fact that I'm a formerly incarcerated person, and one of the reasons I talk so openly about that is how I really got out of white privilege. You might say that a fish doesn't know it's in water until somehow the bowl gets broken and it's flopping around. And I don't recommend that as a way to learn about how black and brown people really live. You know, because I lived in Houston for several years. I went to Rice, my ex-wife went to the University of Houston, but I really didn't get to know anybody from the 5th Ward until I had a cellmate who was from the 5th Ward. His name was Nathaniel. He's a young black man. Did, in my mind, about 1/10 as much harm and got about 10 times as much time for it. But what you can do are things like show up and help with events like feeding the homeless folks under the, at the 7th and I-35, help build houses. There's the Atheist Community of Austin has a ramp building project. There are a lot of projects that it doesn't matter what your faith affiliation is, where you really get hands-on with, get out of your comfort zone, really get to know people that are different from yourself. I had to learn the hard way about how other people live, but there are so many opportunities. I mean, if you have the means, to travel abroad, to get involved in some of the organizations that work abroad with refugees and so forth, that's great too. But those lessons, that's the only way I could learn that, was not from having conversations with folks like we're having tonight, which are great, but to be in direct contact, to share a home, to share a meal, with people very different from myself. Thank you.
I so appreciated our teacher there speaking about how are the children. And what that took me to was, what are the children watching? What are the children hearing? How are the children being taught by their parents who have moved into this kind of milieu that we're talking about, isolationism? So I find the television set doing an awful lot of educating of our younger generations. And I find that they are not seeing helpful ways of interacting one with another, because TV programs are set up for conflict, for violence, for not talking through and coming to a common meeting ground. So where are they getting any of that kind of information? Unless they are in a very unusual household or possibly a Sunday school. I don't see it happening. And I think that's a very key place, because of course we were told that dictators said, give me a child for the first years of their life, and they're mine for the rest of their life. Well, that's still true today. So each one of us can certainly take the responsibility for young people in our environment to share with them kinder, gentler ways of interacting one with another than they are seeing on television.
Just real quickly, I'm Rebecca. I'm with the Ethical Society, and I get overwhelmed with the negativity every day of everything that James was talking about, everything that you all have talked about. There's just so many things that basically make me want to curl up on the couch and watch another Netflix show or something. And what tonight has reminded me is conversations are great, and we do need to have those, but action is all that's going to help us, really. And whether we can act individually well enough to make a difference, I don't know. But I do know that collectively, a small band of people are the ones who make change. So we are here tonight trying to gather together with other groups. And I think the Center for Inquiry, for example, does have action. The Ethical Society has ethical actions. I believe the Oasis does too. You know, many of the folks that we co-sponsored this have it, and if you all are part of groups that do that, I guess I'm just encouraging to take James's call to action seriously. It's going to help me get off the couch. Thanks.
I think that's actually a great final note to leave on, unless somebody has something they simply must say. We can continue the conversation over refreshments, but first I want to say a couple of things. First of which is thank you all so much for being here tonight. It's been a fantastic conversation. We hope the first of many. I did not know this was going to be a thing here, but one of our members at Ethical Society has a campaign to distribute LED light bulbs as part of his goal is to save the planet from global warming. And so he has a whole bunch of these LED lights, which are so much better than incandescents and so much better than those terrible CFLs. Please take a box. They are free. Take one home with you.
I'm gonna
install it. Yeah, take it. I don't know if they'll let you put this on the plane though.
Yeah.
So please do take a light bulb after you've had some snacks and continue the conversation. Please visit our Facebook page later this week to tag your photos. We would appreciate that. And keep an eye out we're going to follow up through email with y'all and let you know about future events. We'll have another event in early 2018. So I wanted to say one more time, thank you so much, James. And James will be, yes, presenting on Sunday morning at the Ethical Society at 5604 Manor. Check us out on Facebook or esoa.org. Enough pitching, not here to proselytize. And there are brochures outside if you like. That Lee, you did work very hard on. So again, thank you all so much for being part of this. Let's go have a little lunch and snacks, shall we?
So much. Yeah,
Okay.